Good afternoon, my name is Josh from CyclonesOZ, and here is your detailed afternoon update on Tropical Cyclone Alfred, currently a Category 3 strength severe tropical cyclone located about 400 kilometres northeast of Fraser Island, Queensland. This tropical cyclone is heading towards the Queensland coastline, and a landfall is now expected in about a week's time. We're going to be going through all the details in the system here in relation to the forecast, movement and intensity of this tropical cyclone, and what you need to be doing now along the Queensland and New South Wales coastline to prepare adequately for this tropical cyclone. All the details and more coming up into this afternoon's forecast update. If you are brand new to the channel, please consider subscribing, but let's get stuck straight into things now. With a look at the system, it is currently at Category 3 strength severe tropical cyclone status, but it is getting eaten apart right now by wind shear, which is ripping the storm structure to smithereens, and it really is on a rapid decline right now in terms of appearance and also in terms of intensity. The system here likely to be downgraded to a Category 2 strength tropical cyclone later on this afternoon. It really is not performing very well for itself, and it is doing quite a lot worse than expected, but still 102 km/h winds being reported on Frederick Reef, which peaked out last night at 130 km/h, with peak gusts up to 150 km/h. So this is a very powerful tropical cyclone still, and winds down here on Caddo Island, 89 km/h, 90 km/h here, so damaging winds here sustained, with gusts up to 125 km/h right now, and it's outside of the storm's inner eye wall, which means the winds are going to get likely a lot worse through there. Wind speeds averaging 50 to 60 km/h are also being reported now along the Queensland coastline, with winds up to 80 km/h now along Fraser Island, with gusts up to 110 km/h, and the conditions are now rapidly deteriorating across some of these locations too. If we zoom right in here and have a look at the radar imagery, you can see in the latest frames some heavy bands of rainfall starting to move ashore, with some very heavy falls expected to develop across parts of Fraser Island later on this afternoon and evening as this tropical cyclone draws a little bit closer. It doesn't really look like this radar imagery here wants to load in, but you can see if we push it right forward, you can see that there is some heavy rainfall now really beginning to develop here along the northern tip of Fraser Island. So again, conditions will just continue to deteriorate throughout the remainder of today. This tropical cyclone still has a little bit more marching to do towards Queensland. You can see its closest approach will be sometime Sunday afternoon in towards Sunday evening. You can see here probably its closest approach right now at about 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. This storm will be about 250 kilometres or so towards the northeast of Fraser Island here as a Category 2 strength, still a powerful tropical cyclone here, with peak winds expected to be sustained around that 60 to 70 km/h mark, with stronger gusts also expected through here. And just considering the fact that the wind's already a lot stronger than what the forecast is suggesting along Fraser Island, I reckon we'll be seeing peak wind gusts on the extreme northern tip of Fraser Island up to about 125 km/h, likely even a little bit stronger than that, with wind gusts up to 110 km/h along the south central Queensland coastline between Gladstone down towards Bundaberg, and winds up to 100 km/h expected tomorrow afternoon between Hervey Bay down towards Maroochydore. So again, really strong winds expected along the Queensland coastline, not something that they see every day, and it will feel like a tropical cyclone. It's going to be cloudy, there'll be bands of heavy falls coming through, and expecting some significant rainfall accumulations as well throughout the course of tomorrow afternoon and evening. To prepare adequately across this part of Queensland, just make sure you're pruning up your trees throughout the remainder of today. You've got the rest of today before those conditions really do start to get quite gnarly later on tonight. Make sure you've got plenty of beer in the fridge as well to get yourself through tomorrow and in towards Monday morning as well. This tropical cyclone will be in close proximity to Queensland, so you're not going to have too much to do apart from sit and look at the storm out in the window or on the computer, whatever suits you best, and have plenty of cold ones ready to go. That's the Queensland way to do things up in cyclone season. But yeah, definitely be prepared for some strong winds throughout the course of today. Wind gusts up to 125 km/h expected in exposed coastal locations on the mainland, and up to 140 km/h expected on Fraser Island. And to be honest, my jaw is on the floor at how there isn't cyclone watches at the very least in place right now for this part of Queensland. They're going to be receiving full-blown cyclone conditions at the very least on Fraser Island, and considering winds already start to feel like a tropical cyclone here and there around Noosa up towards Rainbow Beach, and also some strong winds currently being experienced around Bundaberg, I'm absolutely baffled that there isn't a cyclone warning in place of these places here at this time, or at the very least a severe weather warning. It really does stun me. Throughout the remainder of tomorrow, we're expecting the cyclone to pull away from the coastline in towards Monday morning, expecting this to pretty much pull away from Queensland entirely here and head a bit further out towards the ocean through Monday afternoon and into Monday evening, and then it's going to slow down and stall once again. This tropical cyclone will likely weaken below Category 2 status down to low-end Category 1 strength tropical cyclone status, and it will likely be stripped of its convection and thunderstorms on Monday afternoon, which means that it is going to look really ugly on satellite imagery. It's also going to be a lot weaker than what we're currently expecting right now, and that's because wind shear values are expected to be through the roof. And if you know anything about tropical cyclone tracking, you'll know that wind shear values of 50 to 60 knots is kind of run for the hills. You want this tropical cyclone to get away from that kind of wind shear value. If you're looking at a strong storm here, it really doesn't look like this system stands a fighting chance here as it gets further out into the Coral Sea here. throughout Monday afternoon and Monday evening. It's just going to get stripped to tears, and then through Tuesday, further weakening is expected. The tropical cyclone is expected to stall over less than ideal sea temperatures as well as we get through Tuesday, and again, that just hammers home the point that this tropical cyclone isn't going to remain very strong, with sea temperatures 25, 26 degrees, pushing 27 degrees at times, depending on how far north it stalls. But the tropical cyclone will be very slow moving through Tuesday and in towards Wednesday, and this is where it turns to the worst for Queensland. Expecting the tropical cyclone to head towards the Queensland coastline through Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, with the tropical cyclone landfall expected somewhere between Bundaberg down to the Queensland-New South Wales border, and yes, that includes Brisbane and the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast as well, sometime between Wednesday the 5th of March out to Saturday the 8th of March. And I would like to preface the next few minutes of forecasting with saying that this is just a forecast right now, and whilst it is looking very likely that it is going to happen, things can change, and this tropical cyclone could completely fall apart here out in the Coral Sea. That's also a pretty significant possibility at this time, and the forecast models haven't really picked up on that, which could mean one of two things. I'm really overreacting with how hostile the conditions are going to be for this tropical cyclone, or they just don't really know for sure at this time, and I'm banking on the fact that they don't really know, which means that this tropical cyclone more likely than not is going to come ashore as a weak system, but we need to be going through all of the possibilities at this time and make sure that everybody is informed and know how to adequately prepare for this system. Let's just jump straight into it right now. Again, I'm just going to preface this by saying that this is a forecast and things can change. Through Wednesday, we're seeing that movement towards the coastline. The EastMLF forecast calling for some significant intensification just before landfall as those sea temperatures start to increase a little bit through Thursday night and into Friday morning before a landfall on early Friday morning rather, on the top of Fraser Island as probably a high-end Category 2 strength Category 1 strength tropical cyclone, pushing in towards Category 2 status at this point here. Again, in line with what the Axis G3 forecast is calling for. They're calling for that landfall sometime through Thursday, as well as that high-end Category 1 or early Category 2 status. Tropical cyclone somewhere on the Sunshine Coast, again, anywhere north of Brisbane, especially immediately north, will bring the worst conditions ashore around the Brisbane area, especially into the northern parts of Brisbane along the Moreton Bay area and up towards Redcliffe. We'll be expecting some significant wind gusts there, but considering the Axis and the EastMLF are saying pretty much the exact same thing in terms of landfall timing and also in terms of intensity, high-end Category 1 or early-end Category 2, that gives me great confidence in saying that we're expecting that landfall somewhere between the northern tip of Fraser Island down towards Brisbane at that time. That's where it's most likely to occur. The GFS forecast model is calling for this tropical cyclone to stall a little bit further north, and as such, it's calling for that tropical cyclone to pull back in towards Queensland as a strengthening system and then making that landfall a lot further north, still at the same time late Thursday night around the Bundaberg area. So there are a few discrepancies between the forecast models, but in terms of timing and the fact that it is going to come ashore as a weak tropical cyclone, there's really no discrepancies between major forecast models at this time. Even the Icon forecast model, which I rarely use in these video updates because it can spit out some absolute garbage, is calling for that landfall around the Brisbane area sometime late Thursday in towards Friday morning, again as that high-end Category 1 or early-end Category 2. So considering all four major forecast models are saying pretty much the exact same thing, and the Bureau of Meteorology forecast in the 7-day forecast period is calling for that landfall on top of Brisbane as a high-end Category 1 strength tropical cyclone. So you've got 5 major players in the forecasting community saying that this is going to landfall around the southern areas of the Sunshine Coast. I mean, we very rarely see that consistency on any tropical cyclone, whether it's out to sea or for landfall. So at this time, it is looking exceedingly likely. The conditions are actually pretty healthy right along the coastline. We're expecting this tropical cyclone to be on the up in terms of strengthening as it gets towards the Queensland coastline. Like I said, those sea temperatures do come up to about 27 or 28 degrees Celsius right along the coastline there. So the tropical cyclone will certainly be able to intensify as it gets itself closer to the coastline, which means it's going to be blowing up plenty of thunderstorms, and as such, rainfall accumulations are expected to be a bit of a problem across the southeastern corner of Queensland. This leads me very nicely on into the next part of the video, which is discussing the impacts that a landfall would bring. Regardless of if this tropical cyclone makes landfall, it is expected to head very close to the Queensland coastline at tropical or tropical cyclone intensity, so rainfall accumulations over the course of this landfalling process, which will take about 48 hours, are expected to be quite dramatic. We're talking up to about 500 millimeters in the mountainous areas outside of the Gold Coast hinterland, then up in towards the Sunshine Coast hinterland as well. Wherever this tropical cyclone makes landfall, anywhere further south, that will be picking up the majority of the rainfall here, which, to be honest, right now with that landfall, most likely expected between Fraser Island down to Maroochydore or Bundaberg down towards Maroochydore, that will bring the heaviest falls around the Gold Coast and the Brisbane area, especially in towards the hinterland, where rainfall accumulations between 250 and 500 millimeters look to be very much possible on the cards right now. And again, if you switch forecast models here and have a look at other forecast models, they're saying pretty much the exact same thing here. So I'm really not seeing any reason to doubt the forecast models at this time. Whilst it's a little bit too early to tell exact numbers for locations, I'm expecting Brisbane to pick up about 200 millimeters of rainfall through Thursday and Friday, but areas on the Sunshine Coast could get up to about 250 or 300 millimeters in that time frame, and then the highest accumulations out in the mountainous areas, especially down in the Gold Coast hinterland out towards Boonah, Bow Desert, that sort of area, expecting accumulations up to about 500 to 600 millimeters there. So some pretty significant flooding is expected. It's still far too early to tell what areas are going to be worst off at this time, just considering we're not 100% sure about the whereabouts of this tropical cyclone on landfall, and we're going to have to wait until about Tuesday to know exactly where this tropical cyclone is going to make landfall, which is kind of the driving factor behind where the worst impacts are going to be. But at this time, it certainly does look like it is going to be a pretty wet week, or pretty wet end to next week across the southeastern corner of Queensland. I think that is more or less set in stone at this time, regardless of if this comes ashore as a tropical cyclone or remnant energy from a tropical cyclone that's carked it out in the Coral Sea here as a result of Tropical Cyclone Alfred finding itself in too much wind shear. Wind speeds, if a tropical cyclone or a tropical low does come ashore, expecting maximum wind gusts or winds averaging 60 to 80 kilometers an hour upon landfall, with wind gusts up to 140 kilometers an hour here. Again, the forecast models are definitely calling for quite a strong storm here. I mean, you can see the axis is calling for wind gusts up to about 200 kilometers an hour upon landfall. The axis is, of course, always the highballer in terms of forecast models here. I think the east and west scenario here is more likely, so whatever happens here is kind of what is expected. Wind gusts averaging 120 to 140 kilometers an hour on the coastline, with wind gusts averaging about 80 to 120 kilometers an hour expected inland. I don't really see a world where Brisbane doesn't receive a wind gust up to 100 kilometers an hour, which certainly will be some of the strongest winds that they've received since their last tropical cyclone impact over 50 years ago now. Tropical Cyclone Daisy back in 1972, I believe, was the last one to come down and really wallop Brisbane, or give Brisbane a good scare. And at this time, it certainly looks like whilst this tropical cyclone will be on the increase in terms of intensity and power as it comes ashore, the wind accumulations are really hard to forecast at this time, but I don't really see a world where wind gusts exceed 150 kilometers an hour, even for the most exposed or the mountainous locations. Wind gusts will be at their strongest south of Bundaberg, especially through Fraser Island and then down towards Maroochydore. I reckon anywhere north of Brisbane up towards Maroochydore will be receiving the strongest winds, especially just immediately north of Maroochydore, considering that looks to be the landfall hotspot at this time here, and along the coastline wind gusts there could be well in excess of 125 kilometres an hour. But further south of that, apart from the lookouts and the lighthouses along the Moreton Island chain here out in the Moreton Bay area, I'm expecting wind gusts there to be exceeding 125 kilometres an hour. Along the mainland, wind gusts shouldn't really be exceeding that number unless we get a really powerful tropical cyclone come ashore, which at this point is still up in arms. We could be seeing a Category 2 landfall, but it is looking exceedingly unlikely at this time, considering this tropical cyclone, it's going to die offshore from Queensland. I don't really see a world where this thing doesn't completely fall to bits here, and it's going to have a lot of work to do in just a short amount of time, with some pretty unfavourable conditions as well as it gets itself back on its feet around to Queensland. But I mean, the environment is looking pretty favourable in the 24 hours up towards landfall between Thursday and Friday. The environment does look really helpful for this tropical cyclone next to the Queensland coastline, so just how much this system can intensify, if it's a broad system, probably not too much, but if it is a tight, small system, which the forecast models are not really in favour of at this time, it could intensify substantially up back towards Category 2 status. I would just like to say right now, before I go into how to prepare and what you should be doing for this tropical cyclone, that a Category 3 strength landfall is pretty much impossible at this time, and even a high-end Category 2 strength tropical cyclone landfall is pretty much impossible, but still a Category 1 or Category 2 could cause some really significant damage and devastation around the southeast corner of Queensland. They're not built for this type of cyclone activity at all, so Brisbane and the Gold Coast, it's time to really pay close attention to the next part of this video, which is how to prepare for this system. So as we've been saying, anywhere south of Bundaberg down to the Queensland-New South Wales border, we can be expecting a tropical cyclone crossing the coast there, which means for locations north of Lismore up to Agnes Water, it's definitely time to start thinking that a tropical cyclone or tropical cyclone conditions are imminent for your location. Right now, it's still a case of watch but don't act. Like I've said, Alfred is falling to bits out here in the Coral Sea, and it could just fall apart too far for it to really recover and then make landfall as a significant system on Queensland. Like I said, it'd be a historic storm if it did, but at this time, watch but don't act. Keep an eye on the forecast. Make sure you're staying informed with all the forecasts out there on Facebook, the Bureau of Meteorology, and kind of making an eclectic mix in terms of your judgment on all of those. My best guess right now is that it's time to start preparing for some significant rainfall accumulations, especially in the Gold Coast hinterland area. I think that's pretty much all but guaranteed at this time, so between 300 and 500 millimeters. If you live in a really flood-prone area, or you flood in about 500 millimeters in about 48 hours, which again is some really significant rainfall for this part of of southeastern Queensland, even though we're talking about rainforest conditions here in the Gold Coast hinterland. I would definitely be preparing some sandbags right now and getting yourself ready for some major flooding to occur between Wednesday and Saturday next week, so the 5th to the 8th of March next week. I think that's kind of the only thing that you should be preparing for right now. If you're looking at tropical cyclone impacts, just give it another couple of days to really start thinking about making proper preparations right now. But if you are worried or you don't live in a well-built home, then it's probably time to start planning for tropical cyclone impacts, just so you've got the maximum amount of time to get ready. Even if this system does fall apart, which there is a chance, and it doesn't make landfall as a tropical cyclone, it's much better to be safe rather than to be sorry. So preparations now would include pruning out the garden, strapping down loose outdoor furniture. Keep in mind, you've still got a week till this tropical cyclone inevitably comes ashore as a low-pressure system or a strong tropical cyclone here in the southeastern quarter of Queensland, and we're still not 100% sure, but you've got a week to prepare. So strapping down that outdoor furniture, putting the cars in the carport, and getting some water ready as well is probably a good idea at this time. Stockpiling canned food or toilet paper is never a good idea. If this does come ashore in Brisbane, those supply chain networks will be replenished very, very quickly. So again, in terms of stockpiling stuff, unless you live super remote or you're going to be cut off for whatever reason, whether that's flooding or trees blocking the roads and whatnot, then maybe prepare a week's worth of canned food and household necessities. But I think stockpiling stuff in Brisbane is just going to feed corporate greed at this time. I really don't see a massive necessity to that right now. But over the next couple of days, we'll have much more answers on this tropical cyclone. Tomorrow morning, I'll be able to answer in terms of what preparations you should be making for much more certain answers, that's for sure. But in terms of preparations right now, just some light preparations, and for the most part, watch the forecast, but don't act upon it right now, considering there are still a lot of discrepancies and still a lot of uncertainties out there with tropical cyclone Alfred. And of course, as usual, stay safe, stay cool, stay calm and collected. In an event like this, the weather can change at any moment, and make sure you are staying safe and playing it safe, especially as this tropical cyclone comes pretty close to the northern tip of Fraser Island up there. In the next 48 hours, you're going to be receiving some pretty significant winds, that's for sure. But that is all from me today. A special shout out to the channel sponsors, of course, as usual. Their names are on screen at the end of every video, so click the join button down below if you'd like to support the channel, the CyclonesOZ network. Financially speaking, it's a one-man show, so all support is very much appreciated. But that is all from me today, and I'll catch you all in the next storm.